All right, hello and welcome to another episode of the Restored Mind Show. And so on today's episode, we're going to talk about making change that lasts. And, specifically, we're going to dive into the idea of learning skills or techniques or new capabilities to make change. So on this series, and this is part 3 in the series, what we're doing is we're actually going in kind of reverse order, right? And so in the first part of this series, I talked about why changing our environment, right, is usually so ineffective, right? Because at the end of the day, we're still in our environment, right? No matter where we go, right? So if we have a habitual pattern that's showing up in our life, oftentimes, like us just changing and moving to a new city or getting into a new relationship, something like that, oftentimes that's not going to promote any long-term change. And then, on a grander level, if we're talking about, wanting to change something, our environment, to deal with our emotional disturbances, why that's so ineffective as well, because you can't control your environment, right? So then in the last episode, we talked about changing behavior, and that's really the level underneath environment, right? Obviously, it's a better place to focus because, when we talk about changing our behavior, we're talking about looking at the things we're in control of, right? So at least that's a better step. But even then, if we don't have the skill set or the belief structures or the identity to back that behavior change, that's why I talked about, can be very ineffective, right? That's why usually when we try to change a behavior without backing it with anything, often we're able to achieve short-term change. But again, in this series, we're talking about long-term change. So that leads us to where we are in this episode, where we're going to talk about the idea of skills. And when we talk about skill sets or capabilities, this is really about acquiring, new ways to help facilitate behavior change. So, this could be, when we're talking about mental health, right? I mean, we could be talking about this idea of learning skills like cognitive behavioral therapy, and even more specifically, types of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if we're talking about facing down OCD and anxiety, right, or stress-related disorders, stress-related issues, we can talk about exposure and response prevention, right? And these are new skill sets, new kind of frameworks that we can root our behavior in. And this can obviously really help with behavior change, right? I mean, if we can look at like facing a fear, well, yeah, of course, we could stop avoiding, like if we were afraid of flying on planes, we could stop avoiding flying on planes, right? And that could be the behavior change. But when you back it with the roots of understanding exposure and response prevention and really understanding the kind of science behind it, it helps facilitate a much greater buy-in to that change. And this goes into any aspect of our life, right? So if we talk about changing, how we are operating in relationships, right? Or just how we're operating, again, I'm because everything's going on right now, I like to use very current examples at the time of this episode anyway. But things like our experience with the coronavirus and the quarantine and all the restrictions that are currently happening in many of our lives. Well, yeah, we can change our behaviors on a short level, but the skill sets underneath that is going to be very important. So how we manage emotions when they come up, right? Like being able to identify emotions correctly, right? And then if you talk about like in grander schemes when it comes to like the political environment and the atmosphere there, the skill sets about how we're able to notice our own, emotional states in conversations that might be heated, right? As opposed to trying to change the person to make ourselves feel better, right? Or command that certain things happen so that we are okay, noticing that we're not okay in the first place, right? And noticing what's going on, like what kind of, again, stories are underneath that. And the skill set, right? A skill in this instance would just be to notice what's going on in you, right? And noticing there's a disturbance, because so many of us, and this just comes back down to just like stress and anxiety and emotional management, most of us don't even have the awareness that there is a disruption going on. We're usually just responding to the disruption, right? And we assume that it's something external that causes it. So we just react. We just live in a reactive way throughout life, right? Someone says something we don't like, we just react, right? As opposed to ever exploring like, okay, well, what really is going on within me, right? And that's a good example of a skill to develop, right? Of noticing our emotions, right? Noticing when they're surfacing, noticing something that does trigger us, and not assuming that necessarily that the trigger's always a bad thing, right? Oftentimes the triggers are just pointing to stuff within us, right? A lot of times, if you don't like something, many times it's just a reflection of something within you, right? Sometimes, there's a great kind of parallel someone once told me of like the idea of like looking at the world like a mirror, right? In your environment like a mirror. And if you don't like something, oftentimes it's a reflection of something you don't like within yourself. And that's not always the case, obviously, but the skill set of noticing your emotions, right? And when you're talking about overcoming struggles with mental health, I think that's a wonderful skill to start with, right? Just the ability to notice when something's happening, to have enough space within yourself, right? To say, hey, you know what? This is causing an emotional disruption, right? Or, hey, you know what? I'm having these kind of thoughts right now, as opposed to just being so consumed by them that you're just acting without ever questioning it. Because again, that skill to develop that space is critical in making long-term choices that are in your best interest, as opposed to impulsive choices. And many times, that's the first skill to develop with someone who has, who's engaging in destructive behavior. Now, this can be addictive behaviors, right? Whether it's consuming something that's obviously not good for you, or, like gambling addiction, or, porn addiction, right? I mean, all different types of addictive behaviors, but even something as simple as compulsions, right? Because compulsions can be so subtle, right? When it comes to OCD and anxiety, like avoiding things that trigger you, that make you anxious. But over the long term, they're corrosive, right? They lower the quality of life that we're able to live, because our lives become restricted, right? And then we have kind of new limitations, right? And that's one thing, is when you feed fear, your life just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so when we talk about this idea of learning new skills, what we're really talking about is learning new ways of fueling your behavior, right? And new skills to fuel your behavior change. And, a good example of this can be simple things like mental noting, right? Noting when you have a feeling come up, or noting when you have a thought. But it can also be things like ERP and cognitive behavioral therapy, or even meditation, right? Meditation is a skill, right? It is a practice. It's a skill that we're able to develop, where we take time, right? And at Restored Minds, we're big fans of meditation, because we know the power of creating that space, right? But that happens through practice, right? We practice the skill of creating space between ourselves and our emotions, between ourselves and our thoughts. And that's a really good example of, again, practicing a skill that will drive behavior change, that will create long-lasting change in your life. Right. And that's why when we go deeper in these levels, right, we start with the environment, then behavior, then skill sets. We understand that the deeper we go in this, the more effective the change is going to be over the long term. And then again, that's what the goal of this series is to really help you promote, or create and promote and sustain long-term positive change in your life. And oftentimes it requires us looking in the complete opposite direction where we would normally look, right? But in the upcoming episodes, I'm going to be talking about kind of the two levels that I prefer to look at, obviously within myself, right? But also with people that I work with, right? And that is the idea of belief, right? And identity. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a glimpse of what we're going to be covering, when we talk about changing belief, what we're really talking about is changing stories that we have, right? And a lot of people will say different things or call these different things, like I've heard them call agreements that we make, right? But really a belief is just a story that we tell ourselves about something again and again and again. It's not a truism, so to speak. It's not the truth. It's just a belief, right? There are like laws and there are truths out there, but beliefs are our perception about truth in many ways. And once we're able to see how, like, let's just look at an example. If you have a belief that you can't get better from an anxiety disorder, well, you can see it doesn't matter what skills you learn or behavior change or environmental change you make. If you're maintaining that belief, it's just going to trickle up into everything else, right? If you have a belief that, about like it's impossible to have a successful marriage, it's like, okay, well, you can see how that would, trickle in pretty negatively to your marriage, right? And the beliefs that we make are often created subverbally, right? Like they're things that we just create through observation sometimes or through things other people say. And if we don't challenge belief, again, a lot of times we're setting ourselves up to fail before we even start. And then underneath that is when we're really going to talk about identity. And that's really some of the most powerful shifts you can make. But again, we're going to get to that in the next episode. For those of you who, have been following along, we always appreciate your support. And, if you'd be taking time to like and subscribe and share this with others, we would really appreciate that. We also have resources available to help you on this journey if you're dealing with stress, anxiety, or OCD at restoredminds.com. We have free guides, free assessments, downloads that can help you on your journey as well. We also have our private community that we do live workshops as well as, recorded trainings and meditations that, again, everything's just designed to help you on this journey from the comfort of where you are. And so for those of you that have been following along, please check that out. There's some links down below where you can get, directed right to those resources as well. So thank you for taking the time to hang out with us today. And we will see you in the next episode where we're going to dive into beliefs. Thank you. Talk soon.